doing this now because, well, I'm sure it's useful, but this morning I wasn't very well.
Yes, sir.
First thing, and if I'd been needing to do it this morning at 10 o'clock, I couldn't have done it. So there's just a possibility I'll have a medical problem on Friday, but I hope not, obviously. But
yes, sir.
It's happened. It has been happening sometimes.
Yes, sir.
Anyway, I'm nearly now to start the video.
Yes, sir.
I've got to. I put my. Now let's stop video. I'm not. That's the microphone.
I'm able to see you.
You start it. Do I start it?
You can just start right away because I'm already started recording your voice.
Okay, I'll start then.
Yes, sir.
And I'm timing it for 20 minutes. Right. Well. Good morning, or is it afternoon? But whichever, I'm very pleased to be speaking to you at this conference, even if I can't be present. And I'm grateful to Professor Verma for the invitation. And of course, I am very interested indeed in the subject of your conference. And I think it will be, and I hope it will be, a very worthwhile discussion. Now, I want to begin with some possible issues that are worth focusing on. I certainly think they're quite important and maybe relevant to the conference. Now, in general, there's no doubt that media and communication studies has been a success story, and it continues to be so, and it grows and it changes in different directions. And the problems that I mentioned, the issues, are in some sense the problems of success, or they may be problems perceived by not very well informed critics. Whatever the reason, there are some reasons for giving some attention to them. Now, I just name 4 or 5 of these. That will be the background to my talk. First of all, and I need hardly, I don't need to say much more, there is a great diversity of themes and topics and directions, and this diversity is mirrored in the different backgrounds from which those attending the conference come. Secondly, and in part as a result of the diversity, there is a certain lack of coherence in what is meant by and what is media and communication studies. It hardly can claim the status of a discipline. It seems to lack some essential characteristics that would identify it in the way that the classic disciplines of the social sciences and humanities and natural sciences have been identified in the past. And the word identity is another one that comes to mind. Do we have a shared identity? Perhaps in some sense for administrative, organizational reasons, but in practice, we come from such diverse directions and go in such directions that we don't have the same identity. We can hardly say, I think, that journalism and journalists are likely to feel the same identity as advertisers or government information officers, for instance. We are, in that sense, very different, and there are much more diverse aspects of the study. Another, and related to the alleged lack of discipline, is the lack of theory. Well, I will come back to that because I think that is a mistaken assumption because it doesn't seem very obvious from some of the kinds of work that is done in media and communication studies. In the matter of theory, I think one could also say that media and communication studies has been very much guided by what I would call, what others would call, a theory of technological determinism. So the focus of study has nearly always been, or has tended to be, on some new technical media communication technical invention that will, it is said or thought or suspected, change human communication and have considerable effects or be very effective for certain purposes. But technology and any novelty of technology and change in technology seems to have driven the subject over the last century. And in connection with that, I could also add that those who are within the field often feel there is rather too much attention given to the matter of the effects of this or that innovation. Now, a word or two about the origins of the field, because we have a history and we are stuck with it and cannot change it. But there's no doubt that the study of communication began primarily as a useful service to often governments or institutions and to commerce that would help improve the effectiveness of their own communication. So government information, propaganda for various purposes, or public relations or advertising. All these things, if they were understood better, could be more effective and more cost-effective. That was one of the driving forces, as well as other more altruistic aims of improving education or improving the cultural level of a society. Now, my own start in the field was in the late 1950s, and it reflected very much this kind of origin, because I had the task of studying the so-called effects of the new medium of television on politics in the United Kingdom, and also on education at school and higher education level. Now, that period of research occurred as I was practicing as a sociologist, and wouldn't have thought of myself as primarily a communicologist or a communication scientist. Gradually, I have started to take on that identity, but this early period of my own career was marked at one point by a time spent at the Annenberg School of Communication in the United States, which was not matched by any similar center in Europe, I don't think. And it opened up to me the potential of there being something like a science of communication, a core subject. And that was the start of my own interest in the potential for developing a communication science in a more disciplinary sense. I'll come back to that a bit later, and I want to frame the rest of my remarks around the notions of an older paradigm and a newer paradigm. Early communication study was openly, or sometimes not, but in general it was under the guise or influence of what can be called, I call an old paradigm, which was essentially that relating to a mass society. It was related to the power of mass media as centralizing influences in highly organized society. So the mass media were central to control. They were central because of and important and effective because they were the means of uniform communications in a one-way direction to large populations, and this was believed to be a key to centralized power, because the model of society essentially was one of a center-peripheral society, a hierarchical society in which influence and power flowed from the top downwards, even if we were in formally in democratic situations. That was the background model inherited to a large extent from history. well, if that was an old paradigm, then the newer paradigm is one that we're also probably even more familiar with. And that is basically one in which, again, technology is the key factor, as it was with the old paradigm of mass media. Here we live in an age, or beginning to entering one, have been for the last 2 or 3 decades, in which technology has changed very much in public and social communication. Most of the features of the old paradigm have been reversed in a sense. We no longer have exclusively one way or massive transmission. We have very multiple and varied sources, highly fragmented audiences, a condition of demassification of communication. We have freedom to communicate ourselves by way of online platforms. And in many ways, we see a transformation. So communications are not the preserve of a nation state. They cross the frontiers and cannot be controlled. And in principle, at least, many of the new channels are not subject to the same kind of control and monitoring that was typical of the old media. Nevertheless, and I'll underline this at the end, the fundamental dynamics and structure of power and distribution of wealth, or both of those, have not greatly changed. We should remember the old media still remain, are still very popular, still influential, and in many ways there is actually more control of our communication environment, or gradually the potential for greater control is coming into view. In reflecting on these two paradigms that are contrasted, and it's useful to do that. It helps to think through some of the problems and reveal them. I think it's important to remember that both are normative in the sense that each involve a set of values, in fact, rather opposed values, that direct attention to issues and also offer a guide to research. So, as I sketched it, the old paradigm is mainly negative, pointing to for some harmful effects, but positive effects for others, for those who want to use media for their own ends, mass media. The new paradigm, on the other hand, is generally positive, welcoming the openness and freedom and diversity of communication and of intercommunication. But there are always values, and mostly these have to do with the familiar values of our societies, our democratic societies, so freedom, diversity, equality or not, solidarity, truth. These are the kinds of values that are involved in the study of communication, and for that reason, and it's not really a choice one can make, media and communication studies cannot be, strictly speaking, neutral. They may be scientific and neutral in the collection of evidence and making observations, but they have to be able to deal with values. And the capacity to deal with values and make valuations is, I think, a basis for the independence and critical capacity of those who practice in this field, which I think is there. Not everyone will want to take advantage of it, but many of the professional communicators will, in their own field, as in, for instance, journalism, want to claim that, and many scientists will claim it as well. Observations of what is going on will claim a certain authority because they are speaking of important values and basing their remarks, conclusions on evidence. One point I want to add here, and that follows from what I said about seeing the potential when I was in the United States at the Annenberg School of Communication for a core of communication. Now, one of the original problems with study of communication, or trying to find a communication science, was there was no agreement at all on any definition of what communication is. And in fact, it can be defined in many different ways, for many different purposes. And my own approach to this is not what I say is the only one. It's not absolute, but it is the one that appealed to me most, and which was to identify the core of communication science as having to do with certain processes of human communication that we are aware of and know about and study, and putting them very briefly, and that's all. Obviously, all I can do. I can name those processes, and I name them as follows: the giving and taking of meaning, the transmission of information in all forms, including stories, drama, art, the exercise of power or influence, the formation and maintenance of social relations in groups and other settings, from family to nation. All these involve processes of communication and intercommunication. And then the matter of expression, again of all kinds, as in art, and writing and politics and many other ways. The laying down of pathways of social contact that can be observed from the contacts and interconnections of people in their communication behavior. All these provide a core and a potential definition and of communication. Coming closer to my conclusion, I would interject here a question, which I've written it down. It does seem a bit pointed, and it is: what is the point of science of communication? Now, I don't know whether any of you have been asked what that is, and I don't suppose they have. But one might think about it sometimes, given that there are many other branches of inquiry in the social sciences and human sciences that could deal with many of the same problems. And I would answer as follows: that the point of the science of communication, of a science, if we have one, is to expose the underlying rules of communication in different contexts, and in brief, to show how communication works. It helps to unite also the different subfields. If that is a problem, this diversity and lack of unity, and I think it, in some sense, it is the lack of a feeling of common enterprise, then a communication science would help resolve that. It provides such a body of scientific theory and work, provides for the accumulation of knowledge instead of just having to repeat questions and find answers to the same kinds of question. It is, I think, again, going back to a point I made, the basis necessary for independence and a critical capacity. It is, I think, finally increasingly relevant in an information society where image and impression play such a part. And I want to end a short introduction to your conference, or my own introduction anyway, by putting some propositions which are one way or another related to what I've been saying. And firstly, I would say that what I call the old paradigm and the new paradigm, which I'm sure you recognize quite easily, are not alternatives. They are not. They are not. We don't have a choice between one or the other. The old paradigm remains with us in many essentials in our societies, and in some ways, as I think I said, it is strengthened by the addition of new technology, even in forms of social media, which are not alternatives to mass media, but they are out there at the furthest reach of mass media messages and influence, spreading it amongst individuals. Now, neither of these paradigms is sufficient. That's another point that goes with the point just made. There are other ways of thinking about what's going on, and we do need new thinking. So, if that's a proposition, that is my proposition. We need new thinking, and we're not well equipped with global ideas yet, or not sufficiently. Secondly, mainly repeating what I said, communication science is necessarily normative. We cannot and should not try to escape from that. It is a study of values in communication, as well as a study of the process of communication and effects. Thirdly, I would say that, and this is again a truism that many will have learned, as a scientific practice, media and communication studies has always to take into account human unpredictability, reflexivity. We answer back, we change, we understand differently the messages we receive. There are no certainties, and there never will be. And finally, if I wanted to sum up what I want to say, I would say that the key to unity and identity of media and communication studies must be by way of a common body of theory, and it is not an alternative to all kinds of other work in professional fields or inquiry. It is part and parcel of what we're doing. So I leave those thoughts with you and wish you a very fruitful couple of days talking and listening and thinking. Okay, thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you. It's perfect.
Okay, you've got it.